Welcome to the Tzurba Hilchot Shabbat Program with Rabbi Shalom Rosner. Tzurba is a revolutionary halacha sefer which guides you through over 300 topics in Jewish law in a unique signature style. In this weekly series specifically, Rabbi Shalom Rosner learns through the Tzurba Hilchot Shabbat volumes, helping us all master the Halachot of Shabbat in just 2 years. Tzurba volumes are available for purchase worldwide on Amazon. And to learn more about Tzurba, or for those in Eretz Yisrael looking to purchase volumes, please head over to tzurbaolami.com. For more information, see the description below. And now, Rabbi Shalom Rosner.
Okay, let's get into our first discussion of Berurah. We are up to the last shiur number 7 in volume 18 of the Tzurba Rabbanan, the Lax Family Edition volumes. This volume was sponsored Leila Nishmas, Yakir Hexter, and David Schwartz, Zechron Levracha, who gave their lives al Kiddush Hashem, fighting for Am Yisrael in Israel today. And we are up to the last shiur, the first shiur on Berurah. Berurah will have 2 shiurim, the last one in volume 18 here, and the first one in Bez Hashem, the next volume, coming out soon. We spoke about Bishul, we spoke about Dush, now we talk about Berurah. Berurah is one of the, we might call it scarier malachas, but more lenient malachas. How do you have both? On the one hand, it's pretty scary because there aren't too many derabbanans in Berurah. It's either daraisa or it's mutter. But in almost every situation of Berurah that we will see, one could do what they want to do. You just have to know how to do it. Like if you want to cook on Shabbos, you can't cook something on Shabbos. You can't color on Shabbos. You can't clean on Shabbos. Most things are usher is usher. There's nothing to talk about. But when it comes to Berurah, I want to separate something. So most of the time, you just have to recognize that it's a Berurah situation. And once I recognize that it's a Berurah situation, then I could go and separate in the way that halacha says I'm allowed to separate. So it all depends on first recognizing that it is a Berurah situation and then doing one of the strategies that the halacha tells us to do. Berurah is one of the 3 malachas that have to do with separating. If you look on page 291, which is the beginning of this shiur, beginning of shiur 17, so the Gemara talks about Berurah and Zoreh and Maraked are all different types of separating malachas. Zoreh is winnowing, when I throw up the chaff and the light stuff blows away and the heavy stuff comes down. Berurah is separating the rocky particles, what I don't want, and Maraked is sifting. So all of them are different stages of Berurah, but they're all counted separately because there's different stages of the Sidura de Pas of the 11 malachas for making bread. So let's get into Berurah. Berurah separating in a way that is, there's a way that's going to be separating that is usher, and there's a way that's going to be separating that is mutter. Separating, let's call it Berurah, is usher. If I separate in the way that Chazal tell me to separate, then it's not called separating, it's called what's derech achila. It's called the first step of usage, the first step of consumption, the first step of eating, and therefore it's not Berurah. So once I realize and I try to do these 3, then I'm not violating the malacha at all. What are those 3 conditions? That's all based on one amud of Gemara, Shabbos Ayin Daled Amud Aleph. The Gemara there says, source number 1, there's a brisa that is very unclear what it means, and the Gemara has 3 suggestions. The last one is the one that's accepted, but along the way the Gemara quoted all 3 factors that we hold of. Says the Gemara, Shabbos Ayin Daled. Tana Rabbanan, if somebody has 2 types of food in front of them, borer va'ochel, borer miniach. One could separate and eat, one separates and leaves over. V'lo yivrar, and he shouldn't separate. What does that mean? Separate and don't separate. V'im birer chayav chatas. And if you did separate, chayav chatas. What does that brisa mean? Separate, don't separate, and if you did your chayav chatas, which is of course an issa daraisa. So my kamar, what is going on here? So the Gemara explains now on the top of the next page. Ela Amar of Yosef, borer va'ochel biyad. When it says borer va'ochel, borer v'meniach biyad, the first line is with your hands, meaning without a separating instrument. The second line, which is referring to an issa d'Rabbanan, that is a low-level separating instrument. But kana b'tamchi lo yivra v'imbira parter av alasser. Remember in Hilchot Shabbos, chayiv means asur daraisa, biblically asur. Pater means asur d'Rabbanan, and mutter means mutter. So if you use a low-level separating instrument, a kana v'tamchi, some type of a basket, so then that's asur d'Rabbanan. Benafo v'kfara, but a serious type, a sieve or a sifter, those should not be used. And if one uses those, that's the issa daraisa, chayiv chatas. And the Gemara doesn't like that because the Brisa doesn't say any word about yad, kli. So the Gemara has another suggestion, Elam Rav Huna, where Rav Huna says, Borer va'ochel ochel mitop soles. What's the first line? What's mutter? Good from the bad, the food from the garbage. Let's translate it literally first. Borer ochel mitop soles. Borer meniach ochel mitop soles. If I take the ochel from the psoles, which literally means the food from the garbage, that's allowed. Psoles mitoch ochel lo yivrar v'mbira chayav chadas. But if you take the garbage out from the food, that is asa daraisa, and that you're not allowed to do. But the Gemara also says, the Brisa doesn't say that. Midi ochel mitop soles. The Brisa doesn't say a word about yad and kli. The Brisa doesn't say a word about ochel and soles. So the Gemara has another idea. Ela amar Abaya. Maybe it's about time. Borer va'ochel la'alter. Borer meniach la'alter. La'alter, which means immediate. Miyad. Immediate consumption. You could be borer for right now. Ulabo bayom, but for later that day, lo yivrar, one shouldn't be borer. V'imbir, and if you did, then it's as if you were borer for like a month from now. Nasa geber la'otzer v'chayav chatas. And the last line, Amru Rabbana Kamei de Rava. Amr Lahu. Rava says when he hears this shopper Karma Nachmeni. Nachmeni says good. Nachmeni is a nickname for Abaya, and Abaya, I accept his shita, and therefore the Gemara, at least the Maskana says, the end of the Gemara, the chilik in borer is if you're doing it for right now, it's mutter. If you're doing it for later, it is going to be usher. Even though that is the Maskana of the Gemara, the other factors that are mentioned earlier in the Gemara also come up lamaisa as the Gemara continues on later on the daf. Borer va'ochel bir ve'niach. The Gemara answers, what's the chilik? If it's asur daraisa, darabanan, depends on the type of kli that you use. And the Gemara later on also has an unusual case of termisin, which are a certain type of legume, where the Gemara also gets into ochel mitop solas and psolach mitoch ochel. So lamaisa. Well known, 3 conditions of borer. I need all 3 conditions. I need all 3 conditions to make it mutter. If I have all 3 conditions, so then it is considered as if I am eating, consuming. That's the lumdis, and therefore it's not called separating. I'm not doing a malacha. I am just consuming. Just like I think we mentioned the last year, you can't do a malacha in your mouth. So you can't do a malacha right before you eat as an extension. Right before that. And the Rambam says in Hilchot Shabbos and Paraches, where he starts talking about the malachis, the Rambam says in source number 4, if somebody is being separating good, food from garbage, or he has in front of him 2 foods, we'll get to that, let's skip that for now. The Rambam says, what does he say? He says, ochel, you take in the good from the bad, biyado, with his hand, not with a separating instrument. Lechol la'alter, for immediate usage. All 3. Ochel yad la'alter. Good from the bad, immediate usage, not using a separating instrument. That is what the Rambam says. Habor psolos b'doch ochel. If you take the bad from the good, whatever the garbage from the food, afilu biyado achas chayev. Even if biyad, right? Any one of these might be daraisa. If you take the bad from the good, that's daraisa for the Rambam. If you're missing that condition. So we have these 3 conditions. These are known as ochel, yad, and la'alter, and that's what the Shulchan Aruch says. Shin yutes. Shin yutes is the siman about borer. Shin yud ches is bishul. Shin yutes is borer. By the way, I didn't mention earlier, it's one of the malachas that come up all the time. All the time. The Shulchan Aruch says, "Habora ochel mitop soles." If somebody takes the good from the bad, the food from the garbage. Oh shay lefanav shtimine ochlin. Again, we'll get to that, and I want to skip that for now. Biyad mutter. Habora ochel mitop soles biyado lanicha filu bavayam. If you're doing it for later, nasa kabora laotzer v'chayev. That's also daraisa. Habor psolos b'doch ochel, afil b'yado achas chayev. So if you do bad from the good, it's a nisa daraisa. If you do it with a for later on, it's a nisa daraisa. It's scary. It's a scary malacha, but it's also not so scary because there's a way to do it. There's a way to do it, unlike other malachas. So let us get into each of these we're going to talk about, and we're going to have some examples, and then the next year we'll have many examples in the next volume. But first, let's talk about each of these categories, laying the groundwork. So miyad. Miyad, so it has to be, the language of the Gemara was la'alter, for immediate consumption. So how immediate? How immediate? Like right before I eat? What happens if it takes me some time to prepare for a meal? I'm prepared. Let's say it takes me half an hour to prepare for the meal. So maybe I have to separate now, but I'm going to be doing another 20 minutes of separating. Is that good enough? Is that okay? So that's where Rabbi Hananel says yes. As long as you don't have any major hefsek in between. Rabbi Hananel, source number 6, on page 295, Shabbos Ayin Daled. Ula alter de Amar Abaya, Kolzman she Yoshev ala shulchan va'ochel. As long as you're at the table. As long as you're getting ready for the meal. Right? That is good enough. And that's what the Ramah says. So there, you can't put a number amount of minutes on this, right? It's just before the meal or during the meal if you're using it. The Mishnah Berurah says that too. Explaining that Ramah that we just saw, source number 8 on page 295. Afilu yarech zman asuda kamashos. Even if the meal takes many hours, mikri la'alter, it's called immediate. Kivan sha'brera hi samach l'suda. Since the borah is being done right before the suda, it is good enough to be considered miyad. That's the sheet of the Mishnah Berurah. And again, it does not have a number of minutes on it. The Ramosha writes that beferish. Ramosha says in Igros Moshe Daled Ayin Daled. That's the siman written to Rabbi Eider. A lot of the small chuvas and paragraphs there. Says Rabbi Eider. Says Ramosha to Rabbi Eider. Ein sha'azu shel shiur sha'a. It's not a certain amount of minutes. Ella hazman shehaderechu leisha zu shemisaderes ha'ochlin lahasuda v'kodem lazeh afilu sha'aktana aser. Right beforehand, even if it takes a long time, if it's a 2-hour meal and it takes an hour to prepare, it's all good that whole time. But if you have any break, any hefsek in the middle, even a small amount of time, then that's not miyad. That's not miyad. And that's where a Ribyad summarizes also. It's permitted, in source number 10, it's permitted to do borah activities anytime during the entire course of the preparation, even though the selected items will not be used until much later in the meal. That's okay. Because the entire process of preparing and conducting the meal, that's called miyad. That's called miyad. Number 1. Example, he says, tablecloth, we'll get to silverware and vegetables and cookies and everything. You're allowed to prepare everything before the meal. You're even allowed to do borah for dessert before the meal. It's all considered one meal. It is okay. Rav Avadia in the Chazon Avadia tries to give some times. If it's a small, it depends how many people you have at the meal. If you have a lot of people, it could take half an hour, 45 minutes. If it's a very small meal, then just a couple of minutes. Just a couple of minutes. Lamaisa is only right before the meal. Without doing, you can't have any break. Can't have any break in the middle. Right, that's what the Shemiras Shabbos says as summary. V'shamati, he quotes Rabbi Shalom Rosner. Ki ozeres hamidbach. What if there's somebody who's helping in the kitchen, but she has other things that she's going to do before the meal, but she just wants to do this now and then she'll do other things before the meal? That's not miyad. Ozeres midbach asurla lever l'suda shein omnim lechol achshav. She can't be a borah right before if af she'osa ken gedei ligmar asavudasa lefnei shas asuda. If there's going to be some type of break, right? It has to be right before, without taking any breaks in between. That is what the Mishnah Berurah says by tochein. Let's say you want to put borer and then go to shul and then come back. That's not miyad. If the going to the shul in the middle is happening, that's a break. That's a break. And therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah in source 13, by tochein, where there might also be a heter of miyad, but that's the definition of miyad. But there are also some other interesting questions about, is this called miyad? What happens if preparing something 3 hours before makes it taste better after 3 hours? So there's going to be a big break. But the big break is l'tzarech of the meal, for the food to taste better. Says Rav Shlomo Zalman, that's okay. Says Rav Shlomo Zalman, that's okay. The Shemiras Shabbos in source 14 quotes Rav Shlomo Zalman. V'shamati miyagon Rav Shlomo Zalman oyerbach zatzal. Demistaver she'im l'tam atov shel atavshel. Sometimes you want something to sit in gravy or peeled beforehand. We'll have to talk about peelers. Tzarech shiur b'tzalim munachin bozman rav. You want the onions to marinate, to sit in it for a while. Yesh lomar dechashav al alter v'shari. That's okay. That's mutter because that's called the tzarech of the suda. How much do you have to work backwards? The amount of time it takes to do it, or even if it's going to taste better if you prepared it a certain way. That's what you go back. V'nirlani is daiti bazeh, says the Shemiras Shabbos. The kamosha mutter liver l'tzarech suda. Shel Mea Ish, just like if you're preparing a meal for 100 people. Even though it's an hour before, objectively there's a lot of time. And if it's a 4-course meal, you're allowed to prepare the 3rd course before the first one. So to here, the same thing would apply. If this is when it's usually prepared 3 or 4 hours before, that is all derech achila, and that is all allowed. But if it's fine, if you would prepare it, this is the other way. If it tastes better, if you did it earlier, what if you did it on Friday? Would it taste just as good? Then you should do it on Friday. If you didn't have to do it then, right? He says that's what, again, but if you didn't, and you need to prepare this food now, then you do it now. That's one idea. Interesting, is that miyad? Yes. What happens if you want to prepare food for the guests, which you know they will not eat? But when you serve a plate, you don't want to put just that there are 4 guests here, so I'm going to put 5 pieces of chicken on the plate. You want to serve so that there's shefa, so that people will take and there'll still be left on the plate. People might not want to take the last piece. So is that also called preparing for a Su'uda need if you know some of it is not going to be eaten? And the Chuvas Rav Pa'olam, the Ben Ish Chai, says yes. That's also a meal need. Meal doesn't only mean what you're going to eat at the meal, but what you want to serve at the meal. Says the Chuvas Rav Pa'olam. Vidah, kinis tapakti. He had this question. Beborah shir lamalos haka'ara. You borer for the amount to fill the plate. I want to put it down in front of the guests right now. V'yodeahu, but I know she'ena arachlim ochlim kol mashniach beka'ara. I know they're not going to eat everything. There'll definitely be some left over. It's kavadik to serve them a lot, to serve them b'shefa. I'm going to bring the guests out a half a plate of chicken because there's only this many guests. You bring a whole plate. That's the minhag ha'olam. She'ezah sure is derech eretz, not derech eretz to be minimal in what I serve. So ubaretz li misvara kol ki less than pa. I don't think there's a problem. To gamba zen nechshav tzarech osa suda la'alter. I think that's mutter. The yafal pi, and even though he's bringing a lot more than that's going to be eaten, but it's a tzarech of the suda. The yavavishu maybe akara malaya b'bnei akavid dafka mabakach hine gamzet tzarech kimo achila. This is good enough. The Rav Avadia is not so convinced. Even though Shemiras Shabbos agrees with the Chuvas Rav Pa'olam, Rav Avadia and Chazon Avadia says, I'm not sure. What's his raya to that? I'm not sure. But it seems to be that there is what to be rely on. So it's called miyad, even if it takes a long time beforehand. It's called miyad, even if it's just only done then to taste better. And it's called miyad if it's just being done to make the guests feel good. That is condition number 1. Miyad la'alter, right? Immediate. That's got to be for immediate consumption. What about number 2? Yad. Yad, it has to be done with your hands. That was the chilik in the Gemara. It has to be done with your hands. But one second, we generally don't eat with our hands. We eat with silverware. So, is using silverware called a kli? If I'm using a fork to eat chicken with, I'm going to separate the chicken and the skin. We're going to have to get to how to eat chicken and how to eat everything. But, so is silverware called a separating instrument? So it seems to be a steer in the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah about a spoon. The Mishnah Berurah in Shin Yutes, our Siman, Sif Samach Beis, in source number 17. Now I'm on page 300 in our shiur. The Mishnah Berurah says, if one is skimming off cream on the top of milk with a spoon, that is called borer bekli. That's borer bekli. Hakolet shuman atzaf al pichalav gam zehu bechal borer. That's borer. Alkein yizoyer. Be careful. Shekshiagia samach lechalav yaniach sasam achalav ashari. As we'll learn about what to do, how to unborer the situation. But he says avalika hashuman b'tzimsum, to take exactly a spoon. Let's say it's not milk. Let's say it's fat on top of the chicken soup, and you want to skim off using a spoon. Says the Mishnah Berurah, that's a problem. That's borer bekli. That is the Mishnah Berurah. But on the other hand, the Mishnah Berurah says, in source 18, a little later in the Siman, Shin Yutes Samach Vav, says, V'dat b'tosefte isa machavitzu ma'isa kedera, lahafrid b'kaf ma'achal aveh min arotev. The you have something sitting in gravy, you want to separate it. that's going to be okay. That's going to be mutter. It's derech achila. He doesn't seem to say that it is considered a separating instrument. So is a spoon a separating instrument or not? How do you understand the Mishnah Berurah? So how do you understand it? Two suggestions. Rav Moshe says, well, maybe what are you using it for? What are you using it for? Says Rav Moshe. By the case of skimming the milk, you're using it to separate. You're using it as a separating instrument. You're not using it as an extension of your hand, right? What's the salah hakel? Well, the reason we use forks and knives and spoons is not because we're using a separating instrument. It's just that's the derech eretz. We don't want to eat with our hands. So it's just an extension of my hand. It's a yad arichta. So says the Rav Moshe, if you're using it to skim off the top of the chicken soup or the milk, that's not an extension. That you're using it to separate. Im al yedei, he says in source 19. Igros Moshe Aleph Kuf Chav Daled. Im al yedei amazleg. V'akaf nivrar ben nokel mi biyado. It's separating. Shenimsa shemisayimim l'maisa breira yesh la'achlev zebor bekli v'yesh lesor. But if you're using the spoon just to eat with, you have a piece of meat inside the chalent. I'm taking it out, right? Because I want to eat the meat. That's separating. That's eating. That's eating. That's not the separating. Avalam ein osin la breira klum yoser mi biyado. No, it's not that I'm using the spoon because it's better. I don't want to stick my hand in the chalent to take out the piece of meat. No, it's not derech eretz. Elamach b'sheina rosa l'lach l'chyodo. I don't want to get my hand dirty. Or I'm trying to reach something on the plate and I can't reach it, so I use the fork. Or it's a liquid. All those cases, that's okay. You're not using the spoon to separate, and therefore it is just an extension. It's just an extension of your hand. The Aruch Shabbos has a different, again, contemporary in Yerushalayim does not like that chiluk. He assumes like what's the chiluk is what is something. You can look at the chiluk. He says the only actions usually done as part of the process of food production are prohibited when done with cutlery, but otherwise not. Okay, another chiluk. Rav Ovadia also. He assumes that spoons are always mutter. Spoons are always mutter. He argues with the Mishnah Berurah. He assumes that that's not called a kli borer at all, and therefore, maybe if you would be doing the taking the skimming off of the chicken soup, that would be okay. You'll have to need the other issues. We'll have to get out of solas b'toch ochel and the others, but we will see. Either way, the Shemiras Shabbos passes like the Mishnah Berurah and the chiluk of Rav Moshe. And therefore, if I'm using the spoon, if I'm using fork, and we generally paskin, if you're using silverware just because you don't want to get your hands dirty, so then it's mutter. Rav Ovadia says it's mutter always. The Mishnah Berurah says if I'm using it to separate, then it could be a problem. That's the chumrah of the Mishnah Berurah. The Shemiras Shabbos though quotes Rabbi Shalom Rosner, which has an important shita, which we'll have to get back to. Shemiras Shabbos quotes Rabbi Shalom Rosner, but he's not so convinced of it. He says at the end, v'tzarach iyun. But he says, what if you have a kli borer, but the kli is always borer for immediate consumption? That's the way it is. Not like, let's say you have a colander which you pour noodles into. So that's not for, I can make noodles and put them in the fridge. That's not for immediate consumption. But what if you have, says Shlomo Zalman, a tea bag? A tea bag. Lifting the tea bag out of the tea. Is that a kli borer? Now that tea bag has water in it. And now I pick it up, the water is going to drip out. So is that a kli borer, that bag? Says Rabbi Shalom Rosner, no. Because that kli borer is always meant to be eat right before you eat. That's not called a kli. A kli means lahaniach la'achar zman. That's what the Shemiras Shabbos quotes chiddush from Rabbi Shalom Rosner, source 22. If one wants to be machmir, we'll have to get to that. There are those that are machmir. Take the tea bag out with a spoon. As we'll see, so then you're not separating the liquid from the tea bag. A kli that's miyuchad for borer, but you always use it for immediate consumption. Says Rav Shlomo Zalman, Efshar de'ena b'chlal iser borer liver b'kli. Lufkach, he gives two examples. Mutter lishbok tamsis tei derech misanenes shebefia tiyun. Right, some type of separating, not the tea bag, that's the next one, or to pour it through a misanenet, olahotzi sakite midachakos, or to take out the tea bag from the cup. Shagam shetipos tamsis atem mitaftafos ben asakit, even though some of the drops drip down from the bag when you take it out. Says the Shemiras Shabbos. Now, let me extend this. Some people, not as common nowadays as much, but sometimes people put rice in their salt shakers to keep the salt dry. But when you start shaking the salt shaker, so then the rice is kept inside because it's bigger than the holes. So is that a kli borer? Are you separating the salt from the rice? So according to Rabbi Shalom Rosner, it wouldn't be a problem. It's the same heter. Because this is always used right before. Right before. Ulam, the Shemiras Shabbos is not so convinced of that heter. He assumes that it could be a kli borer, and therefore he does not think that one should use the salt shaker in that. Rav Avadia thinks the salt shaker is fine. You're not separating because you want to keep the rice in. The tiny little holes are there so that the salt can be distributed smoothly on everything that you are pouring it on. But it's not because you're separating the rice from the salt. And we'll get to this later, but I'll mention it now. It could be that there's no concept of psik ratio when it comes to borer. Meaning kavana livrar might be part of the definition of borer. And here, when you shake the salt out, your kavana is to separate and keep the rice in. That happens, but your rice is in there because you want to keep the salt dry, and your salt shaker is shaped like this because you want to have the salt distributed in an even way. So Rav Ovadia, in Surah 23, thinks that it's not a problem at all. Klei haknikra malchiyah she'irvu gargire orez imamelach shebesocha. You put some rice inside. Kadei limnoa lachus b'melach. So there's the moisture. It keeps away the moisture. Hey mutar l'shtavish b'Shabbos. Could you use it lefazer mimena melach alamachal to scatter, to spread salt on food? Al yedei hamichse hamenukav shebemelchiyah. Describes it beautifully. You got the holes in there. Iyavika borer. V'nirel anias daiti lahatir, says the Chazon Avadia. I think it's mutter. Kine klize lo nasel l'shem Berurah. It was not made to be a kli borer. It's made to be a kli that spreads the salt, and therefore that's not a kli borer. What about a slotted spoon? So that is a discussion. Slotted spoon. So the Aruch HaShabbos assumes it's a problem. The Or Latzion, the Yalkut Yosef, say l'chadchila it shouldn't be used. Lamaisa, we could have the same chiluk that we had based on the Mishnah Berurah before. Why are you using the slotted spoon? If you're using a slotted spoon, that's the spoon you found. Not that you're just using the slotted spoon to spoon out. So then that should be okay. You're not using it to separate. If you dafka pick up some cholent, you pick up a potato. Somebody says they only want potatoes. They don't want the liquid. So you pick it up and you wait for the liquid to drain out. Maybe that could be a problem. That's you're using that spoon for to be borer. So therefore, one should definitely l'chadchila be careful of that. So we spoke about two so far. We spoke about miyad, what's called miyad, and if you have a long meal, and if you do it for the covet of the archim, and the other details. And then we just spoke about biyad, meaning what's called a kli and what's called yad. When is silverware okay most of the time, and when not? So let's get to the third one now. The third is ochel mitoch psoles, which I kept translating on purpose as food from the garbage. But now we'll get to how it's usually translated. Because the Gemara, Shabbos Ayin Daled, that same Amud Aleph, Ayin Daled Aleph in Shabbos, the Gemara says, what happens if there are two foods in front of you? That's the case of the Brisa. Two foods, Ochlin, Borer v'Ochel Borer Miniach, our Brisa that we discussed. So two foods. So what kind of Borer is there? As we'll learn, Borer requires a taroves. That's ABCs of Borer. Borer, we spoke so far about what you're supposed to, how do you do borer in a mutter way? But we didn't even talk about, well, when is borer shayach? Yisod one, it has to be a mixture. If it's not a mixture of good things and bad things, then there's no borer. As we'll learn, if you have three cookies, taking one, they're all the same. Taking one cookie, that's not borer. They're all the same, as we'll see. So Tosfos says, Tosfos quoting a bit of Chananel on that Gemara, Shabbos Ayin Daled, two foods. Tosfos says you take borer va'ochel borer meniach. Says Rabbeinu Chananel, de ba'ochel mitoch ochel shaycha breira. Even food and food, like the case we spoke about, the cholent and the potatoes and the meat and the barley. There's borer there. What do you mean borer? It's all food. It's all food. No, sheborer oso sheino chafetz lechol mitoch osho sherotza lechol. If the one that you want, that's called ochel. The one that you don't want is called psoles. The oso sheino chafetz bo chashiv psoles lagabi oso shechavitz bo v'chei mashva b'Yerushalmi. That's Tosfos. Tosfos is the name of Rabbeinu Hananel. Berurah applies to two foods. They're two good things. Doesn't matter. If you want one, they're all jelly beans, but you don't like one color of the jelly beans, that's called psoles. The Rambam does not have this chiluk. The Rambam doesn't have. When the Rambam talks about separating two foods, he only quotes the other two conditions, yad and miyad. Which makes it sound like for the Rambam, Berurah is only when you have something objectively psoles. That's what the Rambam says. The Rambam in Hilchot Shabbos, again, Ches Yud Gimel, 28. Two types of mixed up foods. Right, again, if you have two pieces of chicken on opposite sides of the plate, that's not a taroves. If you have two foods that are mixed up together, Berurah echad me echad miniach lechol miyad. V'im v'hiniach lachar zman. Afilu bo bayom chayev. You could do it miyad and biyad. Rambam doesn't say anything about ochel mitop solas. The Shulchan Aruch quotes the Rambam, but the Ramah sticks in two words to interpret the Shulchan Aruch like Tosfos. What the Shulchan Aruch says, Shin Yutes Sif Gimel, source 29. You have two types of foods that are mixed together. Berurah echad me echad. You take one, umeniach. So the Shulchan Aruch just says lechol miyad, and you leave the other one over. The Ramah adds in umeniach hasheni kidei lechol miyad. Take one and leave the other one over, which is understood as, the Berurah explains that the Ramah is trying to put the Tosfos on the Rambam, which he's not so convinced. That is, whatever you're taking, whatever you want, that's what you should take. Whatever you don't want, you should leave. You should leave. But Lamaisa, that is what we are machmir for. Even if the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch don't hold of it, but we paskin like the Ramah, which is based on the Trumas Hadeshen, which is based on the Rush, and even the Sephardic poskim say that is what we're supposed to be holding. That ochel mitoch psoles. Anything that you want is called ochel. Anything that you don't want is called psoles. And that's what the Rav Shlomo Amar says in source 31. Right, he says, "Lo ma'isa tov lahachmir lachush ladas atosvus v'arash." After all, remember, Berurah is scary. We said Berurah is scary. Berurah is malchad daraisa, and Berurah applies even by non-foods. We didn't emphasize that. Berurah applies by non-foods. It applies by silverware. It applies by clothing. It applies by games. Pieces of games. How to put away a game is a very serious issue on Shabbos, which we will have to talk about. Good. What if you have chicken? You have 5 pieces of chicken. You have 6 different cookies on the plate. Is that a situation of Berurah? The Trumas Hadeshen, as we know, Rabbi Israelin, we assume that he wrote his own shuvas. He wrote the question. He wrote a sefer in a question and answer form. The second volume, the Psukim, seemed to be real shilos. But the first one wasn't real shilos. It was just what he wanted to talk about. And he wrote it in question and answer form. Why is it called Hadeshen? Because there are 354 chuvas. This is the truma of the Deshen. The Deshen, that's the number of chuvas. So he writes in Siman Nun Zayin on page 309. Sheila chatichas dagim munachem aluach echad. You have pieces of fish on a plate. Piece of fish on a plate. O bika'ara mifurado zumizu. Separated from each other. Kamosha begilon laniach kach. O b'shabbos kishbal echol mayan rodza lechol mixason. O l'shayr mixason l'suda cheres. But you want to take some food. You want to take some fish from your fish pieces on your plate. How do you let it do it? Says the Mishumas Hadeshen, Yireh, de lo tzorach l'dakdei kol kach badavar. That's all fine. That's not a Berurah situation. Zelo chashav breira ela dafka b'shnei minim v'lo b'min echad b'chlal. You need 2 minim. You need 2 minim. If it's all chicken, it's all the same chicken, it's all the same min. Devade dafka nakaratana. V'chein kol ha'machabrim shnei minei ochlin. 2 minim. But if it's all 1 min, it's okay. That is a yesod. By the way, the other yesod is that it has to be mixed in with each other. If there are 2 sides of the plate, that's not a mixture either. But in terms of the types, it has to be 2 different types. And that's what the Ramah says. Shnei minei dagim mikri shnei minei ochlim. Vaser liver achamei chaver ala biyado. If it's 2 different types of fish, there's bass and there's I don't know, whatever 2 other. I'm not a fish eater so much, but you have 2 other types of fish that people eat. 2 types of salmon. So that's a Berurah situation. If it's all the same salmon, just 1 big, 1 small piece, that's not a Berurah situation. Afal Pi, he says, Avish Hatichas Gedolos V'Kolachad Dikeres B'Fnei Atzma. Avol Kol Shu Min Echad. Avish Berurah Hatichas Gedolos V'Doktanos Lo Mikri Breira. The Ramah says big and small doesn't make a difference. That's not called different types. The Taz argues with the whole Kula He thinks of the Shumas Adeshen, meaning even if they're one type, maybe what you want is called ochel. And you shouldn't take out what you don't want. That's called psolas. So the Taz argues on the whole heter of the Ramah, even if it's one type, he says towards the end of 34, v'lo yivra afilu b'min echad. Even one type, afilu gedolos b'doktanos. If it's one type, don't separate, because what you want to eat, that piece is the ochel, like Tosfos said. But we assume that many Achronim agree with the Ramah. So as long as it's one type, it's all okay. But often it's not one type. Any time there could be a difference between the two, the Mishnah Berurah says, roasted and cooked. What if there's grilled chicken and schnitzel? They're all chicken. No, they're different. What if there's pargit and chazeh oaf? Right? Dark meat, white meat. That's a difference. So the whole heter of the Ramah is where there's no difference, there's one type, and the size doesn't make a difference. But if the size is going to make a difference in quality or different types, how it's prepared, then that makes a difference. Chocolate chip cookies and cinnamon cookies. That's a Berurah situation. Big and small. Tablespoons and teaspoons. That's a Berurah. It's just spoons. No. It's a Berurah situation. And you have to do good from the bad, and all three we'll have to get to if you want to set the table the night before for the next day. How do you do it? We'll have to get to that, Brother Shem, in the next year. But a Shabbos socks and weekday socks, these are all Berurah situations. One should care, and that's what the Aruch HaShabbos says in source 36. He gives many examples. If it's all one type, we're all good. But if not. Amnam im elu chafatzim. Asher shimusham shonez zemizeh kegon garbayim gedolos v'ktanos, big or small socks, sichos rosh gedol v'ktanos, pins. That's a taroves. Different types of chicken, like I said, dark meat, white meat. Different types of chazeh oaf, knafayim, wings. Then it's an issue. If you're makbid on certain ones, he says, so then that is an issue. So therefore, we should be careful and recognize Berurah situations. Give you another example. The Shemiras Shabbos says matzah, whole matzahs and broken matzahs. Sometimes you open up a box at the Seder, you're like, oh, these are all broken. Okay, here's a whole one. Let's just put these separate so we know which are the whole ones. So I'll separate the whole ones from the broken. There's a different quality in a half a matzah and a whole matzah. You could use this for shalom. You could use this for lechem mishnah. So again, anything that has a different in quality, that is okay. If you look in the Chavadas, beginning of the Sefer, he talks about whether you're allowed to do. I might have mentioned this in the past year. Whether you're allowed to do, I think I did when we spoke about the malachas in general. Whether you're allowed to do birchas ilanos on Shabbos, and he goes through many different sugyas about it. Are you worried that you might come to cut off one of the blossoms? But then he quotes in the footnote there that, maybe you shouldn't be able to do Birchas Ilanos on Shabbos because by making the Birchas Ilanos, you are being mevarer the nitzotzos, you are uplifting and separating the pure spiritual sparks from the tree, from the fruit, unless you say, maybe that's ochel mitop solas, that's good from the bad, you're taking out the sparks, and you're doing it for immediate consumption and spirituality. Ravadia says there's no malacha in the spiritual world. And after all, what do you make? A bracha is mavar nitzotzos. Every bracha you make is mavar nitzotzos. You make a berurah eitz, you're mavar nitzotzos. There's no malacha. It's not dumi the malachas hamishkan, and therefore it's going to be mutter, and that's not going to be a problem. Towards the end of this year, they quote here from Rav Elazar Malamed in the Pnini Halacha that Berurah is a message for life. Also, we always have to take the good from the bad. We always have to separate properly. We always have to know what's good and what's bad, and always take the good and consume it immediately, and do our best to fulfill not just the malacha on Shabbos, but Berurah, proper Berurah, during the week as well. Okay, this finishes up volume number 18. We will try to have a shiur or two of Chazara, and then B'ez Hashem we'll get to the next volume of Hilchos Shabbos. We will stop here.